Plugged in, polarized, fist raised in anger, staring down, don't meet the eyes. Everyone's a stranger, 1,000 tunes ringing in my ear, no time for conversation. Plugged in, polarized, fist raised in anger, staring down, don't meet the eyes. Everyone's a stranger, 1,000 tunes ringing in my ear, no time for conversation. 1,000 channels run to my brain, no thought, just sensation. Don't look at me, can't you see? I don't wanna talk to you. Why be disconnected? Why be disconnected?
How's everybody doing? How many people in here use xParticles? How many are on version 4? You guys aware there's a new beta program? No. I found out yesterday, do not switch over to the beta program if you plan on opening back up your old projects and instantly having them work. The dynamics and several other things miss the mark a little bit. Isn't that hard to fix them if they're not too complicated, but I ran into a couple that there was just no, be easier to rebuild them. So, what we're going to be doing today, I'm not going to be showing a lot of particle simulation, obviously. The content that I'm going to be showing is usually done at 4 to 12K on screens that are anywhere from 30 to 40 foot high to, down to as little as like 12. So particle counts are too high to sim. So we're going to be going more through techniques and little tricks that I've discovered in helping get the most out of the fewest particles possible. So first of all, this particular project is actually playing on a screen over in Bellevue by the mall there. In the lobby of a new high-rise. On this particular piece, we have, and this is, just to clarify, this is a 3.5 version that I'm running on XP4. So some of these icons have changed. The original layout, switch to the different camera here. Rather than trying to fight gravity, I put all of my particles, emitters, cameras, everything into a single null so that I can scale it. The piece actually plays like it's vertical and squared back in, but I run everything at about this angle so that all the water comes off, re-hits the different pieces. You can see this in this piece right here. That was all produced at that angle. This particular piece has more Krakatoa work. Is anybody familiar with Krakatoa in here? This has a lot more Krakatoa work in it than actually mesh. Krakatoa does a fantastic job at creating massive amounts of particles, but it's also very time intensive due to the fact that you cannot cache your simulation of your particles. You then run it through Krakatoa, which does a random seed on it and creates a PRT file that is, you can do, to get a good one, you need about 20 layers. So it runs through the simulation 20 times. And each time offsets the seed. You then take it into Krakatoa again and run it through where it produces light onto it, onto the particles, which you can then do an additive to, which gives you this look. Let's get into, so within the particles themselves, there's a couple of ways to approach it. You can have the particle set to rate, which allows you to adjust the amount of life and the birth rate. I have this cranked down to 60. I actually dropped it down from 6,000 just so if I did hit play, we didn't crash anything going remote. You can, if you're not as familiar with it, and you get a much better going rate and adjusting your speed, radius, also adjusting your object size, the external pressure on it. You can get a much better simulation. You can, however, go to either regular or hexagonal, and it will put out particles according to the most it can fit in to whatever the object is you're emitting from. Now, if you apply that to a massive object or accidentally apply it to a massive object and turn it on, your system will freeze and crash instantly. So you have to really be careful with that.
What scale, like, are you talking about like hundreds of feet, 50 feet, 10 feet?
I am working at, well, this will give you an indication. The scale I work at is pretty extreme. That's the only way to get the detail you've seen in that video I showed a little bit ago. And it takes, I'm running a system that has 4 1080 Ti's and is a 48-core dual Xeon system.
Did you say 48 core?
Yeah.
Okay, just checking.
That's my small systems are 24 cores. I also have a 36 core. X particles really needs, and it isn't all about the GPU. Everybody talks about GPU now. You really need those cores to crunch the numbers when you're doing these simulations, the meshing. Even when you go to render, the actual render, even in Redshift or Octane, the actual render is all GPU. But it still has to look at that mesh every single time. One trick I have found, how many of you are familiar with Alembic export? It can save you, if you're not familiar with it, check into it. It will save you a ton of time on your renders. It crunches everything down once, puts out this particular, let's see, I'm doing a spot right now. The Alembic file was 525 gig. But it cut a week off of the render.
I'm sorry, 545?
About 525 gig Alembic file. What was that?
How big are your hard drives?
I have several large hard drives that I keep stuff on, and then I have several rated SSDs that I'm always working to. That's the other thing that'll really hold you back. You can't really do X particles caching and stuff off of 72 drives. They just don't have the speed. Even the SSDs really need to be rated up. And when you're done with the project, you get rid of it. you save only the project file, caches, Alembics, all of that you have to get rid of. There's just no way to save them out.
Have you ever sent to a standalone render farm online or a Google render
Not for X-particle stuff, simply because you still have to cache everything, and they're going to charge you for that time that you're caching, or a lot of them don't like seeing caches sent through and filling up their systems. They frown on it. And none of them want a 525 gig Alembic file. The other thing with X-particles and meshes like this is making sure that your dynamics are set up correctly on the object you're hitting. Too much bounce, too much friction. It's really a fine-tuning. It really depends. No project is the same as the next. I've tried, saving them and reusing them, but you spend so much time retweaking everything in. And none of it really, you'll see tutorials out there, none of them by Insidium, but people saying you use this setting, this setting, this setting. It's all dependent on the size of your emitter. If you take and run 6,000 particles a frame through your emitter and you cut it down to a quarter, it's going to blow up all over the place. There's some ways around that. There's some dampening and different things you can do. But all of that will take away from the detail you're trying to get out of the particle sim as well. So in the basic setup, you get your lights set up, and you start with the X-particles system. Put all of the stuff in there. There is a folder in there for other objects where you can put your lights, all of that. Once you get that set up, I always run a small particle sim just so I can see the length of the fall, figure out the timing it takes for a particle to get through it, and go a couple hundred frames past that and put a kill on the particles. That way nothing happens. It doesn't get hung up someplace, especially at this kind of an angle. When I finish up some of them, the particles slowly die off and kill out what is left residual in some of the crevices and stuff. It also makes sure that your speed on your renders and simulations are as fast as possible.
Is that a specifically lifetime kind of parameter, or can you say if you slow down below a certain speed?
There is all kinds of that, and I'm not going to get into that. There's a question section in this that if speed falls below X amount, you can kill it or generate more or, spawn multiple pieces. The other real thing, as soon as you get that calculation done of where they're falling, have all that right, you want to get your kill boxes in, which will save you from having particles fall off into space. Let's see if I can get to a camera that zooms out a little bit here. So right now I have the kill boxes turned off. This one has a kill box that sits at the top that stops anything that would happen to go back outside of it. And the red outline you're seeing here is also a container with dynamics on it that is what everything is bouncing against on the inside. I have to have it turned off so I can... So there's a kill box that if anything happens to generate past there, it gets killed. There's a kill box around the whole system, and I also have a kill box at the base for when particles get to the bottom and die off. The sooner you can get those particles killed, the faster your simulations will be. The other thing, if you're working with objects that are moving, and you're doing it at a, if if your particles move 4 frames or a distance past what frame of your movement, they're going to get hung up. They're going to go inside of stuff. So you have a frames per second, but you also have frames within each frame that X particles will recognize. And say these blocks were all sliding back and forth in and out. You're going to want to raise your frame rate up, and you're going to want to raise your subframes up so that every particle sees every little bit of movement out of your dynamic object. If your dynamic object moves past, say it moves, the equivalent of a foot, and it moves past, 1,000 particles, those particles, when they recognize that they are now inside of something that's a dynamic, are going to explode all over the place. And they're... Well, you don't... I usually do my work at 60 frames, but you have a subframe setting... where is it here?
Could you repeat the question for the...
So you have a subframe step right here under the X particle setting. Within C4D, the basic settings, you have your frame rate. But within X particles itself, you have this subframe. If you have a lot of stuff moving fairly fast, you may want to go up to 16, but keep in mind it's also going to drive up your simulation time considerably. So you don't want any more than you have to on that. You also have, I have collision usually turned all the way up. Accuracy I leave down because that really drives stuff up. But you could raise that some. Close out of this one. We'll go on to the next section. Just to give you an idea of, let's turn on this emitter. I have multiple cameras set up. That isn't usually how I work. I have a 3D mouse that I use, but trying to use it over the Wi-Fi does not work well. So we will... That is the speed for 60 particles a frame. You can also see in there the blue ones that you're seeing generate are the foam particles that are generated by the speed of the original particle. That's the ones you would use within Krakatoa to create your foam. Now imagine cranking that up to where you're putting out, 6,000 frames a second. And that's just one, in this particular one, that's just one of 2 emitters. Anybody have any questions on that portion of it before we move a little bit more into the Krakatoa? Okay.
Just curious, the top of these 5x5s, is there a texture on there? Is that something that the particles are aware of and bounce differently off of that, or is that just a smooth, for graphical purposes?
Them being 5x5?
No, I'm wondering the top of the...
Yeah, everything, all of those boxes have a dynamic on them, an X Particles dynamic tag. Which I will show you. So inside of the dynamics tag, you have an enable. You have an inside and outside, so you can set it to whichever you want. You can set it to any. But I've found when you start pushing a lot of particles, if something does get inside, you're better off letting it escape out without it bouncing around and picking up a whole lot of speed and just kind of breaking out of it, based on that subframe. You also have the friction, and this is all of the blocks themselves. The amount of scatter, the bounce variation, friction variation, and then how much it expands out away from the surface. So if you have stuff that's slipping through a little bit, if you want, and it's not super critical, rather than raising your subframes, you can just raise basically the buffer, the offset off of your object to kind of help try and stop stuff from passing through.
Is that what the expand parameter is?
It is. And you really don't want to go below 1 because it's too close and stuff will get through. Any other questions on that part? Now, this particular piece I did for a company that was going to CES. They give me a lot of business, so I did it for them for free. So the scale is not what I usually like to do because I needed it done relatively quick, make them happy, and they were totally happy with it. But this is the next project I'm going to show you.
How large was that one displayed at?
That was 10 foot high by like 14 wide on an LED screen. It was a 1.9 pitch LED. So from 5 foot back, it's super clear.
Do you have like a large screen around here that you test your videos on? Do you know?
I've tested stuff through Planar. I don't know if you're familiar with them, because I've done work for them in the past, so I've had them run some stuff through. But really, no. I've also done, I don't know if, did pretty much everybody see the Buick GMC stuff? That was, and a lot of this, the setup I was able to record. So that is the screen setup for it. It was 6 4K projectors. We were at, I believe it was close to 26K wide. And there was a fair amount of 3D stuff in it as well, which was hence the reason I bought the 48 core, the 36 cores, and 2 24s, and built my own render farm.
Curiosity on that. I'm sure everyone's curious. How much does that cost for that kind of rig?
The 48 core, it's dropped probably now. At that point, which was like 3 years ago, and I bought they're all HP 820s, I think is what they are. And then I did a lot of the build myself and buying the pieces and the upgraded Xeons. But to buy one like from a company, it would probably be somewhere in the neighborhood of 22 grand.
Or a kidney.
Yeah, I mean, it's not cheap. They've come down a lot now because, and it's crazy because they've come down now because people don't think they need the CPUs. They think GPU will cover it. And not necessarily always the case.
Now we're going to do this in.
So Marvin, how do you, this is a part of your question,
how do you preview, like, for lack of a better term, a low-res sim so that you can actually you can't be working at that gigantic resolution the whole time. You know, just seeing the little emitter was slow enough that would drive me crazy. So, like, how do you preview it?
Patience. You try. You have to find a balance point. As a rule of thumb, the best you can do is drop down from where you want to be on your sim particle-wise and the size of the particle. You can drop down about 3/4.
Just 3/4?
But if you drop down any more than that, your look is not going to stay the same. And at that, it may not, because you have less particles hitting against each other, filling up a space, creating that density.
It's just not particle size alone.
Well, it's the amount of particles, the size of the particle, and the densities. It's once you drop in. So on this particular one, let's see here. So I'm going to drop in and hope it doesn't. So within the new X particles, we have this new XP Fluid PBD. Really, really cool, especially for macro type shots like crowning water drops and stuff like that. It does a fantastic job. I actually really like it for larger stuff as well because of the amount of detail it can give and the control you have over it.
Is it physically based dynamics?
Yeah, well, not as much so as like real flow. X particles is never going to be real flow, which is engineering grade. But then again, we think X particles is slow. It's
So it has a better algorithm for understanding gravity and scale to get the job done.
it isn't a better algorithm. These are basically the piece that I just dropped in, this XP Fluid PVD, is a overall container for these particles, which you can apply different viscosities and stuff to, and it kind of treats them all as a gang of particles. Real flow, literally, if you run a real flow simulation, you can click on a particle, a single particle, and it will tell you its location, its speed, what particles it's touched. I mean, each particle is a smart particle. Hence the reason it takes so long to sim. And I love real flow. I mean, but it killed me to have to work in. I could never do, for the budgets, I could never do what I wanted to do. There just wasn't enough time. Who has clients that want to wait 4 months? You're lucky if you can get 4 weeks out of them. So within this new PBD, you have all of these settings, your viscosities, attraction, repulsion, and that's attracting and repulsing the same particles back and forth, getting really, really fine-tuning it. You have an external pressure, which is just like what it sounds like. If you increase the air pressure around it, it's going to take all of these particles you have, it's going to condense them down and really get the definition out of each group and the buildups and densities of them.
Is that like analogous to air pressure? Or is it just a thing?
I don't know that. I don't know what. I mean, it's a percentage, so it could be air pressure or water pressure. It's just it's the external forces around your particles.
And it has a spatial location in the scene?
No. When you apply pretty much any of your domain, just take a quick look through. Yeah, any of these settings in your dynamic objects pretty much are across the whole scene. You can click a box and I'm not really sure why you would do it unless you were trying to separate other objects away from it. You can tell it to be in this box and only affect things within it. But you can also do that by setting up multiple X-particle systems and tell everything to only work within that system. Or X-particles has groups. So you can assign a green group that you put on this gravity affects group 1, this noise pattern affects group 1, and this particle group is in 1. It gets a little bit clunky doing that because you got to really watch the names of them, and when you start caching out, it's a lot more stuff to cache because you have to have separate particles for each portion of it. You also then have where is it here? Your XP constraints, which is another way of controlling a lot of what we were just talking about. And this you can use in place of the PBD or along with it to try and balance things out and get a little finer tuning. You have a section for collisions, and everything in here is weighted, which is really nice. But you also have a viscosity, which allows you to set connection limits and a little more of the stiffness of things. So you can, if you want, a certain density to stick together, you can set this to be, 20. If you want to break up a little bit more, you could drop that back and say only connect, 15 or 10. So you're going to get a little more groups flying off, more splashing, if you will. So within, let's see here. The other thing to bring up, if you're doing something and you're using this technique of putting everything at an angle, the D3 logo that's in here, seems how you have a water buildup that angles back at the top of that logo, because I had it emitting light. It created a halo, at the top of the water. So I dropped all of the simulation, the Alembic file, down a little bit and let it sit inside the logo and let it sit inside the blocks just a little bit, just to kind of flatten out. Same as if you're doing any type of dynamics. You have an area that particles will hit and kind of form. You get that surface tension, and the bottom kind of rounds off. You know what I'm talking about? And it just looks a little more natural if you can drop it down just a little bit, and the halos go away and become closer to the surface of the letters themselves. I'm used to working off 2 and 3 screens. This is really odd. So I set this one up. Hopefully it's going to, I'm not sure how Krakatoa is going to react. So after you've generated so you can set up, in 3.5, you created a particle generator. You then told it to create particles based on another particle generator. That became your phone. That has all went away in 4. I can't show you. These tags are still in here from 3.5, but they're non-functional. Right here you see this foam and spray, which was set up off of emitter 1, fluid 1, and fluid 2. That has now been replaced, and it's a great way of doing it, but they've basically turned it into one of the dynamic objects we were just looking at. So now you have the foam, which replaces out this old one. And within that, you have all of your settings. You have, think of it as waves. So you have this crest rate. And I couldn't tell you, I don't do enough of like waves on an ocean to really know how all of these settings work. The one I usually deal with is your speeds and your impacts. When something falls or when two bodies of water hit together, it's that trapped air in the center that is generated. So when two groups of particles hit together, they generate particles where they have collided. And it will give you the air bubbles and the foam. At this stage, they literally can be either bubbles or foam. It really doesn't matter. The difference is you mesh them separately. So you'd add let's see here. So you'd get an X particles. And again, this is new to this version 4, this OV-DB mesher. So within this, you could tell all of those foam particles to either mesh and be bubbles or take the particles themselves into Krakatoa to do basically a multi-pass random seed on them, which gives you, say, 15 passes. You load it in through a PRT loader. So this right here, this Krakatoa X particle source, that's what you would drop in to load your particle into, whichever one you want to be your foam. You then have, and then you have to generate that, which takes a while. Then you have to load in your PRT loader. That then takes, say you have 200 frames that you've done out of your created. You load that into your PRT. You tell it, I want 20 passes. It then goes through 20 times through your 200 frames, numbers them all individually, sequentially, up to your, 2,000. It also gives them a pass 1 of 15 or 2 of 15 and an individual number for that pass. The PRT loader, once you load them in, will allow you to determine how many passes you want. Maybe you did 15 passes, but maybe you don't need all 15, or you just don't want to take the time. Yeah.
Sorry for the really basic question, but
Nope.
I'm not understanding what Krakatoa is.
For C4D, Krakatoa takes a particle system. It re-renders it, basically. The first process through the XP loader takes and basically divvies it out, lets Krakatoa know where every single particle is, and verifies all of their dynamics. You then generate your multipass, which is basically, and here's where X particles differs from, or C4D X particles and Krakatoa differ from Max, Maya, all of those. They all have it in 3D space. They're physically, it's a dot grid. C4D does not have that yet. They're trying, but C4D doesn't work on the same principles as a lot of the other higher end, your Mayas, Maxes, Houdini.
But in itself, it's not a particle system? It only takes
It reads a particle system. You then go into, once,
It's more like an engine, right?
it's a render engine. But it's Krakatoa, and that's only for C4D. So once it understands where they all are, it still knows where they are in space, because you can produce a cloud of particles that go out. You can take that, apply Krakatoa to it, and pretty quickly get a really cool 20, 30 passes out of it. Where it becomes an issue if you have an object, like in my box layout. Once you drop in so let's say this cube right here already has one on it. See this M right here? That is a mesh identifier. So particles, if you're looking up at it, particles that land in an area not visible to the camera are eliminated from the render. It's a 2D render, but it understands 3D space and where those particles live. That's the first part of the XP loader. When the XP loader generates all those multi-passes and they get loaded back in, those particles aren't included, and you get, and I have an After Effects project where I'll show you what that looks like. But in order, it's roughly 5 times longer if you include a mesh identifier. So it really, if you can get away with not having a mesh in there, a lot of the tutorials you see on Krakatoa with C4D and X particles, they're not using any meshes in there. It's just clouds of particles being played with.
On the note of learning Krakatoa, when you were first starting in fluid simulation in general and Krakatoa, were there any resources that you found were significantly helpful?
Not a lot. Not a lot. X particles is probably, Insidium is probably the absolute best company for documentation.
Sorry, repeat that?
X particles?
Yeah.
Absolutely the best company for documentation. If you go to their website, you can pull up their PDF manuals and look at them. They also have a full video manual where you can go to any one of these items in here, inside the video manual, click on it, and it will show you a video of what it does and how to use it. Plus, it's gotten really popular and everybody's playing with it now and making tutorials. One of the problems there is going to be, all of the 3.5 tutorials, if you're on 4, are certainly outdated. And if you're watching tutorials on 4 and you're still on 3.5, you're wondering where the hell that thing is. But Insidium has 2 different video manuals, one for 3.5 and one for 4. And it's going to become outdated pretty quickly for 4 too, because with the new beta, which I'm part of, anybody, I highly recommend it. It's great as long as you don't want to open up old, simulations. They're going to keep right now it's about every 3 weeks they're releasing something new. And I'm sure that will slow down to some degree, so there's always new stuff. And they're putting out special training video. Every time they release a new item, they put out a training video on it. So let's see here. So if we go back into... Now this is how many people here have heard of Greebler in C4D? Anybody that doesn't know about it should look it up and get it.
What's it called?
Greebler.
What is Greebler?
I'm going to show you here. It will take meshes, extrude them out, add objects.
Think Star Wars.
Yeah, but most of my block walls are made using Greebler without the greebles. So this is generated completely on the fly just by dropping a cube into it.
It's just a procedural performer.
It is. But within that, you can do all kinds of you can, even things out. You can even do blow-aparts where it takes all the pieces, separates them out, pulls them back together. You can add, and I don't use it a ton for a lot of this other.
Different shapes too, right? Like the avoiding objects in the form.
Yeah, you can create your own. You can use all kinds of. It really doesn't matter what the shape is.
What would it look like if you dropped a circle in there instead? Would it be all those little camel humps over here, or?
Row, no camera. So it's like Houdini.
Yeah, I don't use Houdini. I've been wanting to. It has a lot of really cool fluid simulation stuff in it. I just have not. I got enough on my plate.
Don't we all, right?
But yeah, it's a great little program. Highly recommend it for doing quick shapes and stuff. Oh, and the one thing I didn't hit on, and I hadn't even thought about it in preparing for this, one of the greatest things about the new X particles, underused, is this mesher that I was using to show for the fluid simulations. If you have any shape, say you've done bools, always gets so nasty. You start booling stuff together and your polys get all messed up and it gets crazy. You could then, now within the OVB mesher, do your bools right in that and it creates perfect geometry.
So it's like a real time.
It's high geometry. Just about as much as you want until your system stops working.
So I can throw Dynamesh at it and go happy?
Yeah, it's crazy the amount it'll get up to. Well, it's part of what creates those, 525 gig Alembic files out of the liquid simulation. So, I've taken. I probably don't have any of the photos with me on my phone, but the one I was talking about, I sent it to the guy that I was doing it for, showing him the poly count and if he was going to be able to handle it. Because down at the bottom it's showing you the amount of polys generated, and it was.
How come this is in the SIGGRAPH paper?
Yeah, it was crazy. Any questions on any of the Krakatoa or? Like I said, there isn't a whole lot to the Greebler, although it's a very, very... I'm not even sure. I was going to look on here to see where the Greebles objects.
Do you have an example of a rendered Krakatoa thing that you could show us?
I do. In fact, I can move on to that right now. Yeah, I brought in the
also, as you're queuing that up, is Greeble like, is that a term? Is it a real word, or is it?
It's a real word. I think it's small random particles or something like that.
It's
But
an old modeling term from like, when they did spaceships, literally Star Wars, and they put little pieces of just random plastic, and that's what gives it like the Imperial destroyers that. So with the Greebler, I mean, you can do like cylinders, and you can do different shapes. It doesn't just have to be a square. And then you deform those and put them all over your object to add complexity that isn't really there. So it looks like it does something, but it doesn't actually. It just looks good.
I like it. I like the word.
Yeah, Greebles.
Greebles.
That's how I learned how to make 3D Death Stars.
Yeah.
You make your satellite dishes, you make your turrets, you make your housing stations, and you grizzle it over a sphere, and then you got a Death Star.
And it comes with a huge library of them. You can pick the amount of them, percentage of which ones, and you can create your own to drop in. So this is back to, and all I was doing on this was generating the mesh and the Krakatoa simulation. I put this textures in here just because it was simple, didn't take a whole lot away from the system, but allowed me to see stuff and didn't look too bad. They actually went with I believe it was a metallic look on the blocks.
So did I understand that the Krakatoa render is actually a 2D, almost a post effect?
It is.
It looks at a 3D file, but renders in a 2D.
The final render is 2D, so you have to have your camera moves and everything set. At the point that you've set it up with the XP system, you can still change it, and it knows where your objects, your meshed objects, are if you give them a tag.
So it can do the obscuring.
It can do the obscuring. Now, and I've never used it in it, but they have it for Maya and Max as well. It's literally, from my understanding, it is a point cloud. It's a 3D point cloud that is, you can change your camera moves.
Do you know if they're going to be updating it for this demo?
They say they are, but they've been saying that for like 2 years now. I don't know what the holdup is. Maxon's usually pretty good about it. I'm thinking there must be something about Maxon, the scale, and several other things. Maxon coming from more of a motion graphics background kind of thing, and it does a fantastic job for what we want to do. But the back end of it was never built to be a true to-scale 3D like Max and Maya. There is one of the, no, that's not it. Oh, here we are, crack overlay. So this is one of the Krakatoa overlays.
So is this the buffers that Krakatoa outputs?
This is, I think this one was 15 passes. Each particle is given a light value, and then an additive mode, and you can change the composition of your additive mode, how much shows, how much doesn't. In this, I did several passes so that they were slightly offset.
And it generates this After Effects project?
No, it generates a white. Let's see if I this up. That is what it generates.
So you have to load all of those layers?
Yeah. Well, there isn't that many. No. I think I know what you're getting at. If you have 15 passes, no, it generates it. That's when you're still in C4D. That PRT loader loads those 15 passes, gives you at that point, the ability to change the amount of additive, your screens and multiplies and stuff that are in there. Take layers away. If you don't like a certain layer that's maybe a little bit doing something you didn't want, you can take that out. And then you literally open up a Krakatoa render. So let's... Back in here. Any questions while this is loading?
Have you done much experience with the RealFlow integration in Cinema? And how do you find
I used to. I think the last RealFlow I had, I think, was 2014.
done the RealFlow 10 and then use integration stuff?
No. You're talking about the plugin.
Yeah.
I've never used the plugin that came out. Everything I heard about it, they took a lot of functionality of RealFlow away from it. So basically, it's an Xparticles. And for the money, I'd rather have something that does all the other stuff Xparticles does. I love RealFlow. I could never get the resolution in my liquid renders that I wanted. They just took too long.
My biggest thing is RealFlow has that RealFlow look. You can always tell when somebody's used RealFlow over other things.
You can.
There's a very specific glossiness to that render, and you're like, yeah, I know what you use.
Well, but
Not that it's a bad thing. I'm just saying, like, it has a look.
yeah, and a lot of that comes down to the render that you're using with it. I've been, in the last 4 months, I've done a lot more Redshift, simply because the C4D renderer is too slow. It doesn't take advantage of GPU. I have had issues with Octane not liking those high mesh counts. It crashes constantly. Have not...
Watching a friend do basic stuff and just watching those renders go to like 3.5, 5 hours, like up and up and up. And it's like,
Yeah. I have had very little issue with Redshift crashing on huge Alembic files.
Are you finding that you have to bump up your meshing resolution a lot higher just due to the size of the displayed image?
With Krakatoa?
No, with your fluid render, with your fluid meshing, your fluid smooths.
The scale, absolutely. You have to go up in scale to get the detail you want, way past what the scale would call for normally. I usually go almost, well, you've seen when I dropped in the human figure. Did you see that into one of them? It's 10 to 12 times normal scale. That particular render, the screen itself, each block was about 18 inches. So that person standing in front of it should have, they're about the size of one block, whereas it should have been like up to a knee at the max.
How necessary is Krakatoa with Xparticles?
It isn't necessary at all. You're going to have a hard time getting that foam, that motion blur white look. You've seen the...
It's a little more slick than having that like kind of normal vector blur.
So,
It's almost a little too crisp.
Yep. Here is the Krakatoa look. And there's the nice thing is Krakatoa allows you, there's very little mesh in there. Only in a few places where it breaks over some of the edges to get a little bit of reflection, and the meshes go away pretty quick.
So Marvin, this is a video wall, right? That waterfall thing is for?
Yeah, that was a version of that went in over in Bellevue next to the clock tower by the mall.
How do you group those?
No, it's on a display that is 4K monitors. I think it's like 10 wide by 25 high, something like that.
So Marvin, how do you loop the particles so it seems seamless? Because when you start the emitters, it starts flowing.
You let it go away, and you start it over again.
There's no way to blend it so that
I have on some of them. If another thing I do when you create your meshes, if you start it, let your particle sim flow and end, mesh it, and put it out to a limbic. You can then overlap your limbics to create a longer play without meshing. 15 seconds, you loop it and overlap it 5 seconds. You can get a much longer play out of it before people start noticing that it's doing the same thing over and over.
Is there anything you do in like After Effects to enhance the effect?
What's that?
Is there anything you do in After Effects to enhance the render after you've...
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. This is an example of no Krakatoa. The little bit of, white you're seeing in there is all reflection.
So you were saying in X Particles 3, you used to be able to do that?
To do...
Or 2.5, you used to be able to get the foam look, but now you can't anymore?
No, they changed their... You generate the foam particle, and that's what gets loaded into Krakatoa. You can still do that. All of it, if you want that white look like is in that After Effects file, you have to use Krakatoa. They are starting to play around with some additive and motion blur and stuff in X Particles that I'm hoping is going to replace that. There's a couple of tutorials out right now. Anybody familiar with Mario's work? He just put out one that had some really cool additive looks to it. I'm hoping that they're going to put something out. I don't know exactly how he did that, and to the best of my knowledge, he hasn't put anything out showing how he did it. But that could replace Krakatoa and be 3D, true 3D.
From X Particles, as one of the outputs, can you get a vector motion buffer output?
I'm not sure I'm following.
Screen direction motion vector output. If this doesn't make any sense, it's okay.
I'm not sure I'm following you.
Some renderers track where a pixel is moving and encoded, and it's 2D only, so it's screen motion, and it's going fast. The vector is long. If it's not.
And you're asking that about C4D or about Krakatoa or
C4D and X Particles.
C4D has a great motion blur, super heavy. I couldn't tell you whether, I don't know whether it would be considered vector.
It wouldn't be part of the render, though. It would be a separate buffer.
I know it's an option within physical where you can get vector motion blur. So it'd just be a matter of whether or not X Particles and that motion vector blur agree with each other.
Okay.
So that way you can use like a motion vector blur and nuke and develop your comp from there.
Yeah, and if you're talking about Krakatoa, it kind of automatically gives you that look when you do the additive because you're random seeding a path, and it creates an absolutely beautiful, fast motion blur.
On the client side, is there a kind of characteristic thing that the client comes back or pushes back on anything, or is it all automatic?
I try not to have that happen. I'm very clear up front. Seems how it does take so long, and as it was brought up, how do you can't create a preview for them. It's, the preview is the job. Yeah. And everybody has a different idea of what a real water simulation is or a real waterfall. Yes, 10 people, it's like, anything artistic, everybody sees it differently. Some people want them perfectly clear. Some people want that white kind of splashy feel. Have any of you guys seen the video that's out of it's a water simulation on I'm trying to think of the name of the building. I think it's down in LA, but it's on the elevator door bays, and it covers the full thing. I think everybody loves it, but the scale is off by about 15 times. But everybody loves it. And it cut their budget down 15 times. So that's one of the things you have to decide when you first talk to the client. What is the scale? If you're doing Krakatoa, and this is something to really keep in mind, if you create a Krakatoa at, say, and you're running 15 passes, and you're doing it on a 1080. On your screen, when you're looking at it, it's going to be correct. When you render it to, say, you want to go out to a 4K, it spaces everything out. Krakatoa doesn't understand the resolution on your screen compared to the resolution you're doing it. You will not get what you're seeing on your screen. You have to run a couple of pass tests to make sure your pixel density is what you want. I complained to them about it, and they said there's nothing they can do about it. It's just part of the package. I forget, what was your question? We had started off, I was opening.
We were waiting for that one file to open. Can't recall that.
Oh, it was on the PRT passes, correct?
Yes.
So this right here, this Krakatoa X particle source, within that is what you identify which particle generator you want to use. It then reads all of those particles, and remember, they cannot be cached. If it's cached, you'll get the same seed over and over and over. I usually do a file. Once I've cached what I want and have it just how I want, change the cache location, save, close, reopen, delete the caches, and then use that to set up your non-cached. I've had several times where changing the cache location, let's drop one in. So you have a cache. Within that cache, you drop in everything that you want to be cached. You then build the cache, and it builds it to this location. If you then do a file save as and change this location because you don't want to write over it, you want to write a different cache, I have found that if you don't save, exit out, and reopen, sometimes it hangs onto that location, and you'll wipe out your whole previous cache. And that hurts. So the So this is where you would identify your PRT, the path of the file generated by the XP. The sequence, and then the PRT, you can also put velocity channels and stuff, which will allow you to help change the color, put gradients in, densities, a lot of the information that you get using X particles. This is the amount of partitions to load. If you have 15 partitions, anything outside of that would be grade. You could put in the 15.
What do you mean by partitions?
When you generate your PRTs, when I was talking about, you have a file name, then you have an individual number for every frame generated, then you have a partition 1 through 15, and it'll be like partition 1 of 15, frame 1, frame 2, partition 2 of 15, and so on. And this loads all of them, and then it gives you the ability to start tweaking them and how they mix. It gives you, not sure if it will show well, we don't have one loaded. Yeah, it's not giving some of the options without it loaded in. But allowing you to change the amount of motion blur on them, the amount of additive light to give you those white highlights and feathered off look. Does that answer the question that you had originally when we...
Do you have some sense of the number of particles per frame once you ran out all your passes for the waterfall? Like all your partitions combined per frame?
You can run, if you do a cache, it will show you all of that. You can also take a look at, it generates, so if we go into, say, this emitter right here, turn that one on. This is going to generate 60 particles every frame. How many particles you have is a function of how long their life is, which is what I was talking about. You want to make sure you kill them off as soon as possible. You literally, if we jump this up, now let's say, we've seen it earlier at 60. That's running a little faster now. Now see it start to drag down? That's because it has generated 600 particles a frame and none of those particles have died. And the simulation hasn't even hit the edge yet to start falling, let alone if you're going to fall. And in pricing, that's one of the things you want to talk about is, how big is the screen? What's the resolution? What is the scale to people standing there? What is its physical height? And how much of a fall in density you're going to have to get the look you want. It's not unusual for me to have a particle simulation that has living particles over 5 million. And we'll stop that before it crashes and I can't restart it. Any other questions?
Can you go over some of the technical challenges of rendering, like the render process of like the partitions versus like your actual final renders?
Talking about Krakatoa?
Yeah, like do you render like through the GPU, or do you render Krakatoa like the part like that?
Krakatoa is literally a render. So you have tons of options in here. Your lighting passes, motion blur, depth of field. It's a full-blown render, just like Octane, Redshift.
Two passes basically go render out.
You have to go. When you load in your particle, you have that portion of it. And then you have to generate your PRT, which is a flattened out JPEG ping sequence look, where it's combining multiple passes. So the final render out doesn't take that long. The PRT pass takes a long time. Most of what I do is just using white. I don't, create the gradients. So I don't think that really has much effect on the time of the final render. But the PRT pass is what can take forever. The more passes you have in that portion of it, the better the look you're going to get out of your Krakatoa. You can't, it's a random seed, and that same particle has fallen within just a very close portion of where it was in the previous one, but it's enough to give you an offset and an offset and an offset. But the majority of them are going to fall pretty much along the same path, so it gives you this nice feathered out motion feel to it.
And does so that PRT is developed within C4D as you process the sim, right? Versus
No, it's you set up a particle generator out of XP, out of X particles, that you intentionally want to use within Krakatoa. Typically, you won't have nearly the amount of particles in it. Typically, it's the one that generates little pieces whenever stuff collides or runs off an edge or hits a certain speed. You then take that, load it into Krakatoa. Krakatoa then will kick you out your PRT multi-pass kind of random seed, the same render 15 times, just slightly different. The PRT loader then helps you pull all of those back in, figure out how you want it to look, the amount of feathering, the amount of motion blur. Then you render out a flat ping sequence that you then bring into After Effects.
So Marvin, I've got a kind of workflow question for you. Have you tried just doing a simpler, maybe a quarter of the number of particles, and then starting a different seed, and then using the output of those multiple seeds in Krakatoa? Is it possible to do a simplified pass and blend them together? Because if you're doing a post, and I know it's not technically a post, but Krakatoa is basically a 2D pass on top of particles. Could you somehow save time by, having 5 million particles just seems like hell.
Well, you wouldn't run 5 million particles. Are you talking about Krakatoa or X particles?
X particles.
But you're not, if you don't have the particle density, they're not interacting with each other. And the more particles you have, and then you start applying that external force, the external pressure, and based on the size of your particles, because you literally within X particles can say, I want them to be a 2 or a 1 or a 0.15. That allows them to get tighter together. It gives you a thinner, more well-defined look. That pressure takes everything that's kind of stragglers out on the edge that kind of gives you that random blow-up particle feel, combines them all in so that when they break off, they're breaking off in chunks, which will become your splashes. And it keeps them nice and tight together. And the more particles you have, the cleaner your mesh is going to be.
I was just wondering if there's a way to fake it. Maybe save time.
I mean, if you want to fake it, that's pretty much what I did.
I think after this,
Here.
We'll have time for one more question after this.
I mean, this was basically, in my opinion, this was kind of faking it. This was a relatively low particle count.
That's pretty good.
But it's for the size of what the screen was, it's way off scale. By me working at 10 times the scale, I have to have 10 times the particles. And there really is no way of... You see a lot of people doing liquid simulations that look blobby. That's because they're not working at the correct scale.
One more question?
What do you do while you wait for your simulator?
My workday is broken up on however sims and renders are going. I might work till 2 in the morning getting something set up and then not go back to it till 11 the next day. It's just I try and utilize the system resources as efficiently as possible. And sometimes 3-day weekends come in handy, or 4-day weekends.
Marvin, can you pull up your demo reel so we can watch it one last time?
Yeah. The Buick GMC thing, we had to capture footage during setup. They rode in prototype cars, and then it was worse than airport security trying to get anything in there. I do an awful lot of projection mapping as well.
That's what I'm diving into right now.
I love it.
Fossils.
I just recently got to do projection mapping on a Dreamliner, the 787 Dreamliner. And a lot of this stuff, the Buick GMC thing, we did 15 minutes of content in 5 weeks at, what was it, like 26K or something like that resolution. I had 6 guys working for me at that point, plus I was working on stuff.
All right, let's give a hand to Marvin.